Hello and welcome. My name is Xata, and today we will be discussing the three Helminth abilities Eclipse, Roar, and Xata's Whisper. Which one is better? Why use one over another one? What is the three that most people think is the best one? And is that actually the best one? And what do these abilities even do? Well, that's what we're here to discuss. The purpose of this video is to directly compare Eclipse, Roar, and Xata's Whisper as Helminth abilities. So we will be using their stats as Helminth abilities, as both Roar and Eclipse are altered so they aren't quite as powerful as Helminth abilities as they are on Mirage or Rhino. So when we are talking about them, and we will be using some math in this video to actually figure out which one is the better one, we will be using their stats as Helminth abilities. Additionally, when we refer to Eclipse, we will be exclusively referring to Eclipse in the way it works or will work after its rework in the update Dante Unbound coming out on the 27th of March, which was just released. I was a bit wrong on my prediction, but that's okay. The reason why we will be talking about Eclipse and how it will work post the update and not how it works currently is because I don't want to make a video and then have it be outdated in 2 weeks' time. Pretty simple. Before we get too much into this video any further, basically the idea of this is Xata's Whisper, Eclipse, and Roar are all three damage buff abilities that can be put on any Warframe through the Helminth system. Nourish is another ability that can also damage buff, give Warframes a damage buff, but Nourish is typically used for its additional utility purposes, not necessarily for the damage buff, which is why we're not talking about it. So all three of these abilities do buff your damage, but they buff damage in three different ways, and there's often been a lot of confusion about what these three abilities actually do and which one is actually better, or if there is a better one, or maybe they're just good at doing different things, and therefore neither one is better or are like generally better. Maybe one is better at XYZ and another one is better at, I don't know, ABC. So that's basically what we're going to finally put rest to in this video. Which one is better? Is there an actual definitive better one? And we're just going to talk about it really in great detail and really get into it. So to begin with, we should probably explain the differences, the changes that have been made to Eclipse with the update for complete transparency for anyone who doesn't know. First of all, Eclipse is being changed, so instead of the way it works now, where if you're in a dark area, you get a damage reduction, or when you're in a light area, you get a damage buff, it will now be a toggle. So tapping the ability will give you a damage reduction, and holding the ability will give you a damage buff. Obviously, we won't be talking about the damage reduction that Eclipse gives, as we only care about the damage buff for the purpose of this video. Because of this toggle that is being changed to Eclipse, it also means the ability will be consistent, where before the amount of damage reduction or damage buff you got from it would be dependent on how dark or how light it is. Now you're just going to always be getting the full amount, which means Mirage is actually going to get quite a big buff, as Eclipse will still be at that 200% damage buff, but completely consistent. This also means, though, as a Helminth ability, it is being changed from a 150% buff to a 30% buff, which is the exact same that Roar is currently. A lot of people think this is a pretty big nerf, but I don't necessarily view it that way, as yes, the damage buff is being nerfed, but it's also being buffed by making it a lot more consistent. And if it was to stay at 150%, then why would you ever use Roar? Like 150% versus 30%. Like, it's just so obviously better. So it does make an Eclipse more balanced out with the other two damage buffs, which is really like good game design, just straight up. Like, why would you have two other abilities that are inferior to another ability, where you could have three abilities that are all good for different reasons? Like, that is just good game design, so I don't necessarily see this as a nerf for Helminth Eclipse. I just see it as like a rework to make it a bit more balanced, and that is a good change. It's a good change. And on Mirage, it's still going to be a flat 200%, which is going to be crazy. Mirage is going to be really powerful after this update. So, Eclipse is a final damage buff. That means that it is always multiplicative with every other things that you can slap on your weapon. No matter what mod you have on your weapon, it will be multiplicative. If you don't know what the term multiplicative or additive mean, I'm sorry, I haven't made a video yet covering these in detail. I do intend to. There are tons of other videos that cover what these two terms mean. I am not going to explain it in this video because it's just a bit of a complex thing that I don't want to bog down this video with. So Eclipse is always multiplicative, which is better than additive. Just know that multiplicative is better than additive. Think of multiply versus addition. That's literally what it is in a nutshell. So Eclipse is always multiplicative. Raw, however, is a universal faction modifier. This means that it does the same kind of damage buff that Bane of Grenier, Cleanse Corpus, Might Corrupted, all those mods do. This means that it is additive with those mods. So it will be multiplicative with base damage, just like faction mods are, but it will be additive with faction mods. This also means, just like faction mods, it will double dip with status effects. And Xata's Whisper is actually the most confusing of the three, as Xata Whisper doesn't technically directly buff the damage your weapon does, but instead it takes the damage your weapon does and creates a second instance of, sorry, let me re-explain that. So it takes the damage your weapon does, and your weapon still does that damage. And then on top of that damage, it will take a percent of the damage the weapon does, and then apply it on top of the damage. So it's a second instance of damage, essentially giving your weapon multi-shot. And of course, this also triggers off additional multi-shot. So if you have one bullet, Xata's Whisper will trigger one, giving you a multi-shot of 2. If your gun fires 2 bullets, Xata's Whisper will also trigger twice off each bullet, meaning you technically get a multi-shot of 4, and so on and so on. So to truly figure out which one of these abilities is better, worse, or whatever, we will be using a few set of factors to a simple math equation where we will have the same weapon with the same stats. The weapon doesn't exist, it's a made-up weapon. So we're using a theoretical weapon with a theoretical set of stats, and the only difference we will be doing between the different equations is using the 3 different helmet abilities. So the stats we will be using is, imagine a weapon that has 100 base damage. The actual breakup of which damage types the weapon does isn't important for this example. The weapon will also be modded with Serration, so it will get a 165% base damage buff, and it will be modded with a primed faction mod. Doesn't matter which faction mod it is, just know that it's the faction mod of what faction we're going up against, so it will be benefiting from the damage buff that the faction mod gives us. So it will therefore also be getting a 55% additional damage buff from the faction mode. We will also be assuming the weapon has a multi-shot of 2. The reason why that's important is for Xata's Whisper, basically. We will also be assuming that the Warframe's ability strength is at 100%. This means that when we helmet off Eclipse, Raw, and Xata's Whisper, it will be the baseline, whatever it is, at 100%, which is 30% for both Raw and Eclipse, and 26% for Xata's Whisper. Xata's Whisper is unchanged as a helmet ability. It's 26 on Zaku, and it is 26% as a helmet, so we don't really need a concern there. But Raw on Rhino is 70%, and Eclipse is 200% on Mirage, but we don't care about those stats because we're talking about them as a helmet ability, so we will be only using the 30% buff that they give as helmet abilities. So the equation for Eclipse is 100 times 2.65. That 2.65 is the buff that the weapon gets from Serration. Serration is a plus 165%, or a 100 plus 100 times 165%. This can simply just be simplified by dividing it by 100 to convert it into a decimal, which would give us 1.65, and then add 2. This works for every kind of thing in the game. So for the faction mod, we divide by 100 to give us 0.55, and then add 1 to give us 1.55. So that's where these numbers are coming from. So 100 times 2.65 for Serration, times a further 1.55 for the primed faction mod, times 1.3, which is the actual Eclipse damage buff, and then we're going to go ahead and times that by 2. The times by 2 is just the multi-shot. So the bullet is going to hit twice, and we're going to assume that both bullets do the exact same damage, which isn't actually how the game works, but we're going to assume that they do exact damage, and therefore we're just going to multiply the damage by 2 to factor in the multi-shot. This will leave us with a damage of 1,067.95. So let's compare that to Raw now. So Raw, we start with the 100, and then again we'll times it by 2.65 for duration, and then we will times it by 1.85. The reason why is because Raw is a faction damage buff and is multiplicative with other faction damage buffs. This means that they combine together to make one single multiplicative damage buff. So you take the 30% from Raw and the 55% from the faction mod that is on the weapon and combine it together to create an 85%, which of course is then converted to 1.85. And then after that, we just times it by 2 to get us the final, for the multi-shot, to give us the final result of 980.5. Which should be noted is lower than Eclipse by almost 100. Next we have Xata. Xata is the most confusing equation, because first we have to figure out how much damage the actual weapon is doing, which is 100 times 2.65 for the serration, times 1.55 for the faction damage, and then times 2 for the multi-shot. So we figure out that number, which is 821.5. Yes, 821.5. And then we actually have to figure out how much damage the second damage instance of Xata's Whisper does. So we once again take the base damage of 100, times that by the base damage modifier of 2.65 from Serration. Again, the faction mod of 1.55. And then we times it by Xata's Whisper, which is 26%, right? So Xata's Whisper isn't buffing the damage, so it's not a 1.26, it's just 0.26, because Xata's Whisper does 26% of what the weapon does, and then applies it as void damage. So we take that and then we times it by 0.26, which gives us the damage that Xata's Whisper does. However, Xata's Whisper actually double dips with faction mods. This means that the faction mod will affect the base damage the weapon does, and then which Xata's Whisper then pulls from to figure out how much damage it does, and then the faction mod will be applied again to the damage that Xata's Whisper does. So after we times it by 0.26, we'll times it again by 1.55, and then of course we'll times that by 2 for the multi-shot. Just to say that again without the extra explanation, just so you can visualize the equation a bit better in your head, it is 100 times 2.65 times 1.55 times 0.62 times 1.55 again times 2. And that will lead us to 331.06. That's how much damage Xata's Whisper is doing on top of the damage. So that's how damage Xata's Whisper is doing. So to figure out how much damage the weapon does when we combine the actual weapon damage and Xata's Whisper, we will get 1,152.56. So Xata's Whisper actually shows up on top of the 3 abilities when we factor in this equation. Now, there are a few issues with this equation. To begin with, it doesn't factor in any external damage sources, like health type modifiers. It's also not an entirely accurate representation on how even mods actually affect the damage that the weapon does, as there's this kind of a weird equation to figure out how the weapon does and how it's broken up into the different damage types. So it isn't entirely accurate, but it can still give us a pretty good picture of which one is better based purely on which one's going to buff damage more. And based on the pictures we gave you, it's Xata's Whisper. Eclipse will give you 1,067 damage, Raw will give you 980, and Xata's Whisper gives you 1,152, meaning Xata's Whisper is on top. Now obviously, Raw is the worst of the 3, which might come as a surprise for some people, because I've seen multiple polls on YouTube and multiple people talking in the Reddit, asking which one people think of these 3 abilities is the better ability as a helmet ability. And people people often say Raw. So people often say Raw is actually the best of these 3 abilities as a helmet ability. So I just proved that it's actually the worst, which might surprise people. Of course, most people say Raw because a lot of people wouldn't understand how Xata's Whisper works, and a lot of people don't like Eclipse because of its inconsistency. But don't be fooled, Eclipse is currently in the game, with its inconsistency, much better than Raw. It's better than Raw when it is equal and gives the same damage buff. So imagine how much better than Raw it is when it gives 150% more damage. Yeah, it's inconsistent, so you're unlikely to actually be benefiting from the full damage buff from Raw Eclipse, but you're still likely to be benefiting more than 30%. So yeah, Eclipse is much better than Raw in the current game, and even post rework, it will still be better. So why use Raw at all? Raw is trash, right? It's worse than both Eclipse and Xata's Whisper. Well, that's actually not true. Raw offers very specific benefits. To begin with, as I already said, Raw is a universal damage faction multiplier. A lot of people also don't like to mod with faction mods because they don't want to have to go in every mission and change one mod on their build. If that's you, you can simply just use Raw instead and never have to do that ever again, as Raw will be a faction multiplier for every faction, meaning it will double dip with status effects, damage over times, just like it affects with Xata's Whisper. It's the exact same principle, which is very good. So, and it also means you can free up a mod slot on your build if you were going to normally mod for a faction mod. I have quite a few builds where I just didn't have the mod space to have every mod I wanted plus a faction mod, so I was able to use Raw instead to still give that faction damage buff without having to mod it. And don't underestimate how powerful a faction damage buff is because of the way it double dips with damage over time effects. As a raw damage multiplier, it isn't as impressive as, say, Eclipse, but because of the double dipping it does with the damage over time, it is very powerful. I mean, that faction mod is one of the reasons why Xata's Whisper appeared on top of Eclipse, because it double dipped with Eclipse. So that can show you how powerful it is in that sense. So it can be very useful when you don't want to mod for a faction mod. Additionally, Raw also buffs the damage your abilities do. None of the other two do that. Raw will, even though Raw is additive with faction damage on weapons, it is multiplicative with power strength when it comes to buffing ability damage. Also, Raw can be given to every person in your team, as long as they're in range, of course, where the other two can't do this. Eclipse can do it with an augment, but Xata's Whisper can't do it at all. So Raw could be considered better as well if you wanted to play a more supportive role, so you can give everyone in your team a damage buff without needing an augment for Eclipse. So Raw definitely has a place in the game, and it is still a very good ability, but when it comes to just having a generic damage buff for your weapons, then no. Typically speaking, it is the worst of the three, unless you have other factors like you're using it so you don't have to mod for a faction mod, for example. Xata's Whisper and Eclipse, however, don't have that kind of distinction. Both Xata Whisper and Eclipse are always multiplicative, and Xata's Whisper appears to be on top. It is also theoretical. You could assume that the more multi-shot you have, the more ahead Xata's Whisper will be than Eclipse, because Xata's Whisper will technically be affected by multi-shot twice, as the multi-shot will affect the actual weapon, and then Xata's Whisper will get affected by the multi-shot. So, and also, because it double dips with faction mods, you can make a strong argument to say that Xata's Whisper is just better in every single way, and Eclipse shouldn't be used, because if you need a damage buff like that, use Xata's Whisper. But as I already said, this equation doesn't factor in a lot of things, like health modifiers. Now, I'm not exactly sure when health modifiers are factored into the damage calculation. I do know that Eclipse is a final damage buff, as in it is calculated after your mods. But I don't know if that also means it's factored in after health modifiers. If it isn't factored in with health modifiers, this could definitely give the tide to Eclipse in a lot of content. Why does health modifiers so important? Well, as I said, Xata's Whisper doesn't buff the damage your weapon does. So if you're doing 280 corrosive damage, for example, using Xata's Whisper will still have you do 280 corrosive damage. So it will just create a second instance that does entirely void damage, which is neither good or bad against any health type in the game, except for Overguard and Indifference Facade, where it gets a small damage buff against. Meanwhile, Eclipse will actually buff that 280 corrosive damage, so it's 280 times whatever the damage multiplier of Eclipse is. This is important because, say you're going up against Pharaoh enemies, corrosive will gain 75% extra damage. And if Eclipse is factored in before health modifiers, that means that you will gain more damage from the health modifier. Pretty simple. 75% of 200 is less than 75% of 300. So the higher, the more corrosive you have, which Eclipse would buff, the more damage buff you'll get from that extra 75%. If the health modifier is calculated before Eclipse, then it isn't as important, and Eclipse is definitely worse than Xata's Whisper. But I do think, at least it makes logical sense, that the health modifiers are affected last, meaning after Eclipse. Meaning Eclipse would definitely be a lot better when you want to factor in exactly what damage types you're doing. Now, for general gameplay, that doesn't matter as much. So for general gameplay, you could definitely make the argument that Xata's Whisper is better. But for gameplay where you want to take out a priority target, like a boss, or an Acolyte, or a Demolist, or something like a Kuva Lich, something like that, or more specifically, Eidolons, then yes, Eclipse will be better. As Eclipse, in the case of Eidolons, will be able to buff the radiation damage and the electric damage you get. Actually, I don't think it will buff the electric damage from shields. Ignore that. It will be able to buff, at the very least, the radiation damage your weapon does against the Eidolon, where Xata's Whisper wouldn't be doing that. Xata's Whisper would just also be dealing void damage, which Eidolons aren't weak to. They're also not resistant to it, but they're not weak to it. They're weak to radiation. You want to be buffing the radiation, not be giving you an additional status of damage type that sure gives you more damage, but it doesn't give you more damage, if you know what I mean. So yes, all three abilities have their place, and they all work very differently. And there are other benefits that could be said about all three of them. Like, you could also make the argument that Xata is very good because of the Void status effect, which we won't go in detail because we were more talking about the raw damage application of the three abilities. So each three of them have their place in the game, and all of them are really good abilities. And what might be the best option on one build may not be the best option on another build. So you do want to kind of understand which one you want based on which does what. And I hope this video helped you to understand exactly what the three abilities do, so when you sit down and think, oh, I want a damage buff for this Warframe, you can actually think about which one of the three you want, which one of the three will best support your build. As neither one of them is better or worse than the other, as they're completely different abilities that buff your damage in completely different ways, and therefore will be better at some things but worse at other things. It should be worth noting that if we were to compare the exact same equation that we used before with 100 base damage, Serration, a prime faction mod, and a 2x multi-shot, but used the status effect, and use the stats of Raw and Eclipse on Mirage and Rhino, yes, Raw would appear better, as it would go from 30% to 70%, but the more shocking thing is it would show how powerful Eclipse actually is, because a 200% Eclipse is not something Xata's Whisper can compare to at any day of the week, because a 30% Eclipse is comparable to Xata's Whisper. Imagine how much powerful Xata's Whisper is, Eclipse is than Xata's Whisper when it's 170% more extra damage. And I actually did do the exact same equation, but factoring in the 200% from Eclipse on Mirage, and it results in more than double the damage that Xata's Whisper does with the exact same equation. So yeah, Eclipse is much better as an ability as a whole when it comes to Mirage. And why leaving Eclipse at 150% as a helmet ability would it really work? Because it would completely make Xata's Whisper and Raw obsolete. So not only does this video kind of cover in detail what the three abilities do, but I also hope that the video kind of explained to anyone that is upset by the supposed Eclipse nerf why it actually isn't really a nerf, but it's just good for balancing on the game, because now Eclipse is comparable to the other two abilities, where if Eclipse was able to be left at 150%, it would just be way better, like way better than either of the two abilities, to the point that it wouldn't make any sense to use any of either of the two abilities, and Eclipse is already one of the most used helmet abilities. Like, it would just kind of destroy. Like, it doesn't make sense from a gameplay perspective where you want to be able to make options instead of just having one ability that you use and only that ability, which is exactly why Nourish is getting nerfed, because that's exactly what's happened. Nourish is used way more than any other Helmut ability, and DE doesn't want that, as they want diversity. So no, I don't consider the stat changes to Eclipse as a Helmut ability as a nerf. I think it is actually a pretty good game design. I think there's actually a really good game design reason behind it, and I am actually really excited for the update for multiple reasons, not just for the Eclipse rework, but a lot of the other things that are coming in the update, like a Naruto rework, and of course Dante, a Warframe that I am very excited for. If you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out my other YouTube channel, where I make Let's Play videos. It's just random games, just whatever I feel like. Most of the time I play with my friends, and then I upload those videos there just for the fun of it. Also, if you are interested, do check out the Discord invite that I will be leaving in the description, which will be a link to my clan Discord. I am the warlord of a clan, and if you want an invite to the clan, please join the Discord and we'll give you an invite. We're a mountain clan with basically almost 300 people. We're relatively active, with an even more active alliance, and we have like 99.9% of the research done. So do check us out if you're looking for a good active clan so you can talk to people. Even if you don't want to join the clan, you're still more than welcome to join our Discord and hang out there and talk with people. And also join our Alliance Discord, which you'll be able to do through the clan Discord. There's an invite to the Alliance Discord in the clan Discord, where you'll be able to talk in the Alliance Discord as well, where we have frequent voice chats and we hang out and play the game together. So do check that out if you're interested. And also, and as I say always, I do really hope you learned something from this video. I hope I explained the differences between the three abilities well. If you're still a bit confused, please leave any questions you have in the comment section below, and I will try my best to explain it further in the comments. And maybe consider giving me a subscribe and a like and checking out some of my other videos. Until next time, bye-bye.